had a really great time tonight.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you so much. I really needed to get out. I was kind of, stuck in here.
Of course. Well, be safe tonight, okay?
Okay, I will. Bye. Where are you? Hi, kitty. Aw, good baby. I had the best time tonight. I think I'm in love, kitty. I really do. I wonder if he'll call me. Maybe. Kitty, what was that? Hello? Kitty? Kitty, where'd you go? Kitty? Baby? Kitty? Kitty, is that you? Hello? Okay, this isn't funny. Who is this? Stop it, okay? My electricity is really, really expensive.
You know, I really enjoyed our date. I think I'm gonna enjoy this a little bit more.
Help me! Help me! Help, please! Help me! No, I'm hurt, please! Don't hurt me! Oh! Help! Help, please! Help me! Please don't hurt me, please! What do you want? Is this because I didn't pay half of the check?
Yeah.
Oh, please! Around age 9, I saw my first horror film, and that film was the Amityville Horror. I knew what being scared was, and I knew what was scary, but until that moment I had never seen it played out in front of me on a TV screen. To say that I was traumatized is an understatement, but even though I was incredibly frightened, I was also incredibly intrigued. From that day forward, I indulged in more and more films, from The Bride of Frankenstein to Psycho. The originating fears that I had had instead turned into a love affair that I just couldn't shake. It's because of this fascination with horror in the movies that I decided to pursue a film degree. Horror films are so much more than just crazy knife-wielding brothers and children that can't seem to avoid the inhabitants of a demon. They're time capsules that capture the feelings and history of the time period they were made. This depth is often overlooked as we shield our eyes when Freddy Krueger decides to rather messily murder Johnny Depp in Nightmare on Elm Street. But if people really took the time to read into what they were watching and lower their hands from their eyes, they'd be able to see the art behind the madness. So, today I am here to inform you of the evolution of the horror film. So I'm going to discuss horror's formative years in Europe, its golden age in Hollywood in the 1930s to the 50s, and I'm going to conclude by discussing horror through the 60s to the present. So, before the golden age of film, with well-known characters like Dracula and the Monster and Frankenstein, there was the formative period, where the ideas and concepts of horror began to mold and shape as film technologies and art forms advanced. In order to establish the roots of the horror film, you have to refer back to its origins in literature, specifically the Gothic horror genre. According to filmmaker IQ, Gothic horror arose in the late 1700s to the voices of authors like Edgar Allan Poe and Mary Shelley. With their creepy depictions of architecture, atmosphere, and human nature, they provided a basis for filmmakers in the early 1900s to bring these chilling images to life. According to Bordwell and Thompson's book Film Art and Introduction, Auguste and Louis Lumiere, better known as the Lumiere brothers who invented the cinematograph, produced one of the first horror depictions in their 41-second film Spook Tale in 1895. A year later, George Méliès created what would be known as the first horror film ever, titled The Manor of the Devil. So now let's flash forward to 1920 to post-World War I Germany, struggling to reconstruct. This is where the horror genre finally comes to life through the means of German Expressionism. According to Green Cinema, in their explanation of German Expressionism in 2005, the shadows and creepy elements that made up German Expressionism define the feelings of the citizens of Germany. At a time where propaganda seemed to be the only type of film being produced, German Expressionist films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu provided something new for people of Germany and something that they could metaphorically relate to. Also, according to Green Cinema, they mentioned that as these films become more and more popular and push boundaries further, the directors of these films were actually forced out of Germany and had to flee to Hollywood. This relocation would mark the beginning of America's adventures with horror. Now that we've discussed horror's origins in France and Germany, it's time to discuss horror's golden age, also known as the classical period, that took place largely in Hollywood. Now, prior to the 1930s, Hollywood had toyed around with horror. This was not an entirely foreign genre to them, but it was not until the 1930s that Hollywood finally got its horror formula perfect. According to a piece for AV Club titled A Guide to Universal Studios Monster Movies, written in 2012 by Keith Phipps and Noel Murray, the domination and peak of Universal horror films lasted from 1923 to 1955. During this period, audiences were exposed to a myriad of monsters, from Dracula to the creature from the Black Lagoon. In the same AV Club article, Phipps and Murray discuss how Dracula's success ended up being the key factor that would determine if Universal was going to stay in the monster business or not. Luckily for us, Dracula garnered incredible success, and this success brought on the screen depiction of another famous Gothic horror story, Frankenstein. Now, both of these films were released in 1931, aka the Great Depression. These films reflected and enhanced the feelings of fear that already existed amongst people across America. Dracula and the monster represented individuals who felt out of place and unable to function in society. And this feeling of lack of functionality was also just way too familiar to the American audience. This is what made these films so successful. The messages within the scares were relatable. Now, unlike the 1930s, the 1940s era Universal monster films focused less and less on being metaphorical muses and more on being solely a means of entertainment to distract a wartime audience. According to filmmaker IQ, once Universal entered the late 1940s, the Universal monster did not have the depth that it once had. Universal lost its monster magic and became too formulaic and ridiculous, with titles such as The Invisible Man Returns and Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. Now, this ridiculousness in the 40s would end up carrying over to the 1950s. 1950s horror, according to HorrorFilmHistory.com, was also entirely made up of B-level movies and focused intensely on mutants. So this idea of mutants correlated directly with post-wartime America and the fascination and repercussions of the atomic bomb. Although these films lacked the depth given by their 1930s counterparts, they showed that the horror industry was still interested in not only being entertainment, but a reflection of national and world feelings. So, we've discussed what would have been known as the golden age of film, guided heavily by the geniuses at Universal Studios. But now we have to see how horror has evolved since the golden age. In the 1960s, we were given Psycho. In the 70s, we were given The Exorcist. In the 80s, we were given Nightmare on Elm Street. In the 90s, Silence of the Lambs. In the early 2000s, we were introduced to Jigsaw in Saw. And most recently, in 2013, we were given The Conjuring. A lot has happened in the horror industry since the 1950s. According to the Cinephile.com article in 2005, titled The Roots and History of the Horror Film, once the horror industry returned to expressing serious messages and themes within its stories, it stayed there. It continued to do this. The 70s utilized the idea of demon-ridden children, such as Regan from The Exorcist and Damien from The Omen, to symbolize transformation of America's youth into killing machines during the Vietnam War. In the 60s, the slasher genre was born by the means of Norman Bates' infamous murder of Marion in the shower scene in Psycho. This obsession with the slash amplified in the late 70s and 80s through movies such as Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare on Elm Street. In the same Cinephile.com article written in 2005, the emphasis of the slaughter of sex-obsessed and drug-obsessed teens and the preservation of virgins in the 70s and 80s aimed to counteract the dangers within the love movement in the 70s. The 80s, though it involved a lot of drug-obsessed teens, it wasn't entirely about slaughtering every non-virgin in sight. According to an Empire Online article from 2009, the 80s was a time of great advancement in special effects, which led to more gruesome depictions of horror. Now, the gruesome depictions of horror came to represent our country's obsession with capitalism in films like The Thing and the rise of the AIDS epidemic. That's why there are a lot of movies where people would get into bad science experiments and they'd have horrible reactions and people would see them as these creatures. It really went to emphasize the problems going on with the AIDS epidemic in that era. As the 80s came and went, they took their gallons of fake blood and severed limbs with them, and let the 90s take on a simpler approach. The 90s was a decade of serial killers, from films like Seven to Scream. According to Mark Harris's article for About.com in 2012, the 90s era was an era of horror that received critical acclaim, which was completely dichotomous to opinions of horror in the 80s. As horror carried into the 2000s, according to the New York Times article in 2011, it seemed to take on the same thought process as films in the 1940s. The formulaic nature had returned, and remakes such as Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Texas Chainsaw Massacre dominated the horror market. This transformation was triggered by the attack on the Twin Towers on September 11, 2001. Studios found it hard to determine what was acceptable to release to a public in mourning. According to FilmHistory.com's article about films in the 2000s, it wouldn't be until 2005 that the horror industry would rise again and bring forth box office topping pictures. Since then, our modern generation has been exposed to a mixture of diverse horror storytelling. The horror industry's inability to settle on a cohesive theme shows the lack of a common theme in our national and world society today. The chaotic array of stories being played out on the silver screen right now and over the past few years aim coincidentally to depict the chaos in our nation and our lack of stability and functionality. But not knowing how to reflect our times on the screen, like this is the problem that the studios are having, they're actually indeed reflecting the theme going on in our world society. So today I have discussed the birth of the horror genre in Europe, the golden age of horror in Hollywood, and the ever-changing depictions of horror that existed all the way into our present day. Today I have informed you of the evolution of the horror film. Horror is a genre that has evolved and withstood the test of time. It still brings people to the cinema no matter how horrible the concept might be. But horror is not just in the movies, but it's also in our real lives. The movies just force us to confront our fears and overcome them.